was 22 when I met her. She was bone thin with bleach blonde hair that her pimp had dyed to appropriately suit his nickname for her, his Barbie girl. You see, Sarah met her boyfriend through a process called grooming. He recruited her into a relationship. They dated on and off for about 2 years. During this process, he wined and dined her. He bought her luxurious clothes, took her to steak dinners. And as soon as he perceived her as having enough emotional investment in him, he decided that it was time for her to start paying him back for all the nice things he had done for her. That night, Sarah's boyfriend put her in a strip club. Her boyfriend, her now pimp, made sure that she made extra money for him by visiting the back rooms to go on dates with the patrons. If Sarah met her quota for the evening, she was allowed to go home and go to sleep for the night. If she didn't make enough money, he would lock her in a dog cage. If Sarah even threatened of leaving, he told her intricately how he would kill her 3-year-old daughter. This was just the beginning of Sarah's experience as a victim of sex trafficking. Joseph was 27 when he came from Nashville, Tennessee to Houston, Texas. He responded to a job ad in his local newspaper that read, "Looking for young adults to make extra money." Joseph thought this sounded like a pretty good gig, so he took a bus token from this new employer and took a 24-hour bus ride to Houston. Upon arrival, his new employer picked him up at the bus station and subsequently took him to his new co-ed dormitory, where he would sleep at night and be picked up from in the morning to work. Joseph's employer would take a van around neighborhoods, dropping Joseph and his coworkers off in neighborhoods to do magazine door-to-door sales. At the end of every day, Joseph's employer would collect all of their earnings, but if they didn't meet their quota, they were forced to work more hours the next day. And Joseph's employer would reward this behavior of meeting their quota with field trips to Fiesta, Texas, and Six Flags on the weekends. But this was only a fraction of Joseph's experience as a victim of labor trafficking. So you might hear these two stories and think that they have severely different contexts, right? Yet both of them encompass every single element necessary to create a case for human trafficking. Today I'm going to talk to you about what human trafficking looks like on the local and domestic level, as well as ways you can spot it in your own community, and finally, how you can report and respond to this crime. But before we get into that, it's important to first define human trafficking, as it obviously serves as a foundational framework for this talk. So even though trafficking is not a new crime, laws against it are fairly new. It wasn't until the year 2000 that Congress passed what's known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This was the very first piece of legislation to exist, which made human trafficking a federal crime. So the TVPA breaks human trafficking down into 3 elements: the action, the means, and the purpose. So human trafficking is the action of recruiting, harboring, obtaining, transporting, providing, even advertising an individual by the means of force, fraud, and coercion for the purpose of either labor or sexual exploitation. Now, the only caveat to this definition is if an individual is under the age of 18 and is being exploited for a commercial sex act, they do not need to prove force, fraud, or coercion, because a child can't consent to sex. There's no such thing as a child prostitute, only a victim of trafficking. So now that we have a basis for what trafficking is, I think it's important to talk about what it's not. There are plenty of myths that surround this crime that abound, and they aid in the misconceptions and misinforming of society. So because these are generally socially constructed misconceptions, we're going to call them fake news. So fake news number 1, human trafficking is only an international problem. The reality is that human trafficking is present in every single state in the United States. In Texas alone, it was estimated by the UT School of Social Work in a study done in 2016 that there are 313,000 victims in Texas. Based on calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, Polaris reported that over 1,000 of the calls were from United States citizens, whereas over 800 were non-US citizens. So we can see that it's not just an international problem. Human trafficking inherently is a human rights violation problem. Fake news number 2, human trafficking requires movement. The reality is that someone can be trafficked without ever leaving their home. Human smuggling and human trafficking are 2 terms that are used interchangeably all the time, but they are in fact 2 separate crimes. Human smuggling is a crime against a border, whereas human trafficking is a crime against a person. Human smuggling can turn into human trafficking, but again, they are two different crimes. Fake news number 3, sex trafficking and forced prostitution are the only forms of human trafficking. Like we saw in the study from UT Austin, there are over 313,000 victims in Texas. Over 200,000 of those victims in Texas are victims of forced labor trafficking. So labor trafficking is actually just as prevalent as sex trafficking in the United States. Because commercial sex is already illegal, it's often easier to identify. And because labor trafficking is more difficult to spot, it often goes overlooked and underreported, because someone who's a victim of labor trafficking can be a nanny, a maid, a waiter, a waitress. It can look like someone in our everyday activities. And fake news number 4, human trafficking only affects women and it only affects children. This is kind of part of the glamorization of the crime. We think that it only affects a specific demographic, but actually the International Labor Organization estimated that it's a pretty even split between men and women, where 55% of women are victims of trafficking and 45% are men. And similarly, the majority of victims that we see are actually adults, so 74% of adults and 26% of children. So I do want to say it's difficult to substantiate accurate data when it comes to victims of trafficking, so we go off of what we know based on calls to the human trafficking hotline or survivors that are seen by direct service providers. And this leads us to fake news number 5. Victims of trafficking only come from situations of poverty. There is no such thing as a perfect victim, right? Human trafficking doesn't discriminate against the people that it exploits. So someone can become a victim because they have a weakness. We all have weaknesses, we all have vulnerabilities. So someone becomes a victim when a trafficker has access to those vulnerabilities and then exploits them. Now, there are individuals who are more at risk or inherently vulnerable to trafficking. At-risk youth like runaways, so it's estimated that 1 in 3 runaway youth will be approached by a trafficker within 48 hours. People who are experiencing homelessness, immigrant and refugee populations, and anyone with past physical or sexual trauma can also be more susceptible to exploitation. And finally, fake news number 6. Traffickers are strangers who kidnap their victims. The reality is that, like trafficking doesn't discriminate against victims, it does not discriminate against who the traffickers are as well. Traffickers can be family members, peers, boyfriends, organized criminals, third-party recruiters. We've seen trafficking occur in churches, in homes, in airlines, and in schools. A study by Covenant House, which is a safe house in New York, did a study with their own survivors and found that about 36% of their survivors were trafficked by an immediate family member, so a mother, a father, a brother, a sister. The next highest percentage was 27% were trafficked by a boyfriend. So now that we have hopefully deconstructed what you've previously known from Liam Neeson and watching the movie Taken, let's talk about some red flags of how you can spot trafficking in your own family, or in your own community, sorry. Oftentimes we think that trafficking only occurs in really seedy places, right? We're not going to strip clubs, we're not going to brothels, but the reality is that trafficking happens everywhere. It happens in Abilene, Texas. So not every single case is the same, but there are some commonalities that you can look for when identifying this crime. So truancy, perpetual running away, luxury items without an explainable source of income, a lot of times for minors, especially if they have an older boyfriend or an older friend who is providing these things, that's something to look out for. Tattoos or branding. Remember that pimps especially don't view their victims as human beings. They want to brand their items because that's an object to them. So oftentimes they'll brand them with an image that will depict some kind of royalty. So maybe it's the pimp's initials with a crown on it, or the word daddy or prince more often than not. Multiple phones or social media accounts. Unfortunately, with the internet comes trafficking. So the internet is one of the most prominent ways that traffickers are exploiting their individuals now. Backpage is one of the most popular places for individuals to be sold. So sometimes you might find social media accounts with sexually provocative pictures on those accounts. Unexplained injuries, third-party control of schedule and interactions. Traffickers also want to isolate their victims, right? They don't want them to be in communication or around the people that they are used to depending on, because the trafficker wants that person to be completely dependent on themselves. So during the exploitation time and throughout the trafficking period, the pimp will continue to isolate. For red flags of labor trafficking, like I mentioned earlier, labor trafficking is very difficult to detect because it can look like an everyday job. So unless you witness the physical abuse firsthand or you get to know the individual who is being trafficked, it might be more difficult for you to identify these red flags, but this list can kind of help you with your education of continuing to learn what to look for. So again, third-party control of schedule, much like Joseph's story that I shared, he wasn't in control of where he went or where he ate or where he slept. So he worked on or lived near the premises of his job. Evidence of violence, an inability to speak English. Oftentimes for foreign national victims, their traffickers will withhold their documents. They'll take their visas, take their IDs, and then whenever they say, hey, if you want to call the police because you don't like it here, well, they'll deport you because I have all of your documents. Lack of knowledge about the community, severe malnutrition or dehydration, untreated disease, and dental or visual problems, as well as security that's designed to keep workers inside instead of out. So for premises that are labor trafficking their victims, a lot of times they'll have barbed wire that's facing inward instead of out. So now that we have reached just a fraction of the plethora of information that exists on human trafficking, you're probably wondering what you can do to help. This is a huge crime that has been historically existent, and it's not necessarily going away. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that all we can do is pray this injustice away, though I'm not going to deter you from doing so. I'm also not going to tell you that the only thing for you to do is give all of your money to an anti-trafficking nonprofit, but if you want to, we can talk later. What I will tell you is that it's difficult to condense one of the most complex and intricate crimes into roughly 15 minutes. So the first place for action is for you to continue educating yourself. Without continued education, there is no awareness, and thus we know without awareness, there is no action. So continue educating yourself and empowering your community members to know more about this. Deconstruct myths that maybe your friends have as well. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is your go-to resource for anything trafficking related. If you get that gut-wrenching feeling where you think that you see something that's off or you hear of something that might feel a little bit weird, even if you don't know for sure, this is the number for you to call. If you want to put it in your cell phone, I implore you to do so because this is your number to call. It will go to direct service providers and law enforcement in your area. It's written as a palindrome, so it's easier for you to remember. It's 888-3737-888. As soon as you see something, you want to call this number as soon as possible so you can provide actionable information. You want to provide as many details as you can. It also has a texting capability, so if you don't feel comfortable calling and giving out some information, you can text them as well. So oftentimes we live under this assumption that whenever something unjust is happening, that it's not necessarily our responsibility, right? There's people out there that can take care of it. We can kind of hang back and just learn more. But the reality is that if you know about it, if you see it, if you hear it, this injustice is your burden to bear as well. Thank you.